Welcome to the Spent the Rent podcast. I am your host, Patty Rose. My guest today from the Springfield City Council is Leonard Stoehr. Leonard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Patty. Thanks for having me on the show.
This is really an honor. I haven't really had the chance to formally talk to you. We've talked a little bit on social media prepping for this. And
right.
The more I read and the more I research about this interview, the more impressed I am with your resume. It's very much a Springfield story, even though you're kind of an implant, and we're going to go ahead.
It's kind of a motley resume. Yeah.
Right.
I think you could probably say it's checkered. Yeah,
for sure. But I think it definitely is very reflective of the Springfield community. And I'll get to why I think that in a bit. You know, how you can support the podcast. So the podcast is always free. But if you'd like to support the show, you can go to STRPOD.com for PayPal and Patreon links to become a monthly donor. And starting today, you can go to Venmo. Anybody listening can go to Venmo and you can make a one-time donation on Venmo, and it's at Spent the Rent. So for anybody that would like to support the podcast, you can do that. So Leonard, thank you so much. Do you mind if I call you Leonard? Is that all right?
That's what I go by. Absolutely.
I'm so bad about that, about using people's titles and all that stuff. And I know I should be a little more professional, but thank you so much for doing this.
I don't go by Councilor at all, so don't. Don't stand on ceremony here.
Sure. So let's start out with talking about some of your early days. So you grew up in Georgia, is that correct?
No, I was a Navy brat. I moved every 2 years when I was growing up. I moved to Georgia when I was 21.
Okay. So as a Navy brat, do you have what you would consider to be like a childhood home base, or is it like the world?
I would say that, I would say it's pretty much the world and wherever workers are. Sure. I mean, sure. That's pretty much where home is. Yeah.
So one of the things that I was reading about that kind of caught my attention was that early on you had studied English at Harvard College, but ultimately decided to join the working world and found yourself working in freight as a truck driver. Tell me about the early days and what was going through your head at Harvard that led you to change course.
Okay, well, I was an English major, and near the end of my sophomore year, it started to sort of come into focus that you had roughly 3 career paths as an English major. You could go to law school. I knew I didn't want to be a lawyer. You could become an English instructor. I wasn't really into teaching, although I think it's an honorable profession. And you could also drive a cab. And I thought, well, hell, I could just drive a cab now. I mean, I thought maybe it would be as exciting as I thought it would be. And I never actually drove a cab. I wound up being a construction grunt right out of college. But yeah, I don't have any regrets. I still read a lot. I still am definitely a fan of writers and literature, but it's not something that I do full time anymore.
I've definitely noticed that from your Facebook feed, just reading the kind of the things that you're into. You've got like an eclectic taste, very appreciative of art and film and music. Music is huge. I know that you're a big music guy. And this is kind of why I thought that you had such a Springfield story, is that working in construction, like you had just said, and freight, that I'd like to talk a little bit about today. But you have probably bumped elbows. I know that you've bumped elbows with such a wide spectrum of individuals. And that's really important when you're going to be in city government, or in any government, because I think that you need to kind of be able to listen to people that are from all, different belief systems and whatnot.
And in organized labor as well. I think it's important just to be able to go out to a gate somewhere and be able to talk to anybody that should be passing through.
So how did you get involved?
I agree with that.
How did you get involved with freight?
So I was I was working for about 12 years in a warehouse in Georgia. And the observation that I made after about 10 years was that the truck drivers that were coming in and making deliveries were seeming to be having a lot more of a good time than the people who were working on the dock were. And so I thought this might be something I want to look into. I found out that there was, in fact, a community college that was offering classes. This was 93, offering classes in how to get a commercial driver's license. And then I dropped out of out of the job on the warehouse dock, and much to everyone's scorn, and went for 11 weeks to DeKalb Community College and got my commercial driver's license. And then I got a job shortly thereafter at ABF Freight System,
So when
which
you
is
start,
a union carrier.
okay, that's what I was going to ask. When you start out, is it all independent or is it a union deal? I mean, are you still an independent worker? I mean, when you're doing that, when you're working in freight as a driver, even as a union guy, are you still kind of on your own? Like you have to have your own truck and all that kind of stuff?
It's a very hard life for the independent truckers out there right now. God bless them. I mean, because they're being pinched and squeezed by these large truckload carriers and are getting constantly undercut on their rates. You probably heard this joke. There was a farmer that won the lottery, and they asked him what he was going to do. He said, "I'm going to keep farming until it's all gone." And so I think it's pretty much the same case for an independent trucker right now. I mean, they're really just hanging on by their fingernails and trying to make their truck payment. I mean, then there's insurance, there's fuel. God knows what an independent trucker is doing right now with diesel, $6 a gallon. I can't even imagine.
So when you started out, were you working completely independently, or were you working with a crew where you're more of an employee?
I was an employee from the very start. I was an employee for a couple of non-union companies right off the bat, but I never bought my own truck. I never really aspired to buy my own truck because I knew what headache it was going to be. I barely want to do my own taxes, you know.
Sure.
It's a very hard life.
Well, and I'm an independent contractor barber, and sometimes the idea of ownership is really enticing because you want to set your own pace and kind of control the just be the boss, you know, but
understood.
It's not necessarily worth the trade-off. Sometimes it's better to just be the worker, and not have all the other headaches. So
what I found enticing about being a trucker was that once you've left the yard, you can more or less tell yourself that you don't have a boss. You always do. I mean, there are dispatchers on either end, and they can call you at any time. But for the most part, they leave you alone, just let you do your job. And it's not bad.
So I wanted to ask you about something I thought was really kind of fun. So I Googled Leonard Stoehr, trying to research for this episode, and it turns out you were a guest on Jeopardy back in, was it 2003? Yeah. Is that correct?
2003. Yep. Sure
yeah.
was.
Tell me. So
right before the Iraq invasion. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a good timestamp. It was a 4-episode stint. So you did okay. You did pretty good on it. Tell me what that experience was like.
I had tested a total of 6 times. They called me to be on the show one time before that, and I had been my grandmother was very ill and was about to die at that point, and so I knew that my head would not be in the game if I were to go out there at that point. And I said, "Look, I really appreciate the opportunity, but I can't do it at this point." And so I went back and I tested for the show again. That at this time, it's all online now, but at the time you actually had to go downtown to your chosen city and take a written test, and then play a mock game with the buzzers. And so it was a very sort of long shot, sort of a moonshot to get on the show in those days. And they did call me again, and so I thought, okay, it's now or never. And I went out, and I was very lucky to win the first game. It was one of those things where everything changed in Final Jeopardy, and then I won. I won the second and third games fair and square, and then the fourth game I was just steamrolled by this guy who was a stay-at-home dad and beat me to the buzzer every time.
That's so cool.
It was a good game.
What an experience, and I mean, is it all pomp and circumstance? Like the studio, when you're in there, is it pretty neat, or is it just like the magic of television where actually it's like kind of looks all, like a facade?
Magic of television. The studio the studio appointments are not at all elegant. I mean, they're and by the way, the people that are there as your handlers could not be nicer or more cordial. They make you feel right at home. But that there's not it doesn't look like Television City in Hollywood. It looks like it looks like a studio.
It's like a
I mean,
warehouse.
with
Yeah. So now tell me about what led you to Springfield. So, I mean, yeah, you can tell me about that and then we'll go from there.
Sure. After I had been a road driver for 12 years at ABF, I had become the shop steward with my drivers. There were about 250 of us when I got on. And then the local invited me to run with the leadership at my Teamsters local, invited me to run as recording secretary over there at the Union Hall. And I did. I served for 6 years, and I supported a candidate for Teamsters president named Tom Leadham, who is affiliated with a sort of a breakaway faction of the Teamsters called Teamsters for a Democratic Union. We advocate for rank and file activism, and what we combat is top-down leadership that doesn't value transparency with the members. And so Tom lost that election, but after the election, he asked me if I would consider becoming a rep at his local out here in Oregon. And we have an office in Portland, but we also have an office in Springfield, and this is where I wound up. And I've got to say, I lucked out. I landed in clover, as they say.
And what year was that? That was 2011. Is that correct?
2011. Yeah,
okay,
sure was.
cool.
October 2011.
Yeah. When did you decide that you were going to run for city council?
That was 2016, and I was recruited. I was recruited, and a woman who's in the House leadership now, who is very tired of hearing this story, so I'm not going to use her name. She asked me if I was interested in running for city council, and I said I'd never really thought about it. And then I said, "Can't you get anybody else?" And she said, "Well, we did," and they all said no. And so I looked into it, and the guy that I was running against was a guy who had a history of non-inclusion, let's say, of our Latino and our Black community.
Was that Dave Ralston?
That was Dave Ralston. Yeah,
I've been hearing some stuff about. Yeah.
So Dave, there were a couple of things that were triggering that sort of got me into the race. One was that Dave had said that I'm trying to remember. Oh, Centro Latino Americano, which is an outreach group to recent immigrants. He said that anybody who accepted the help of Centro Latino Americano must be here illegally. And then he also said that there was a Pacific Islander woman who wanted to be on the police advisory committee. He said, we already have a minority on the police advisory committee. And so I thought, that at the time that I ran, it was very sort of opportune because the business community had more or less decided that it wasn't really a great idea to have somebody saying those things on the city council, and they didn't endorse me, the business community. I didn't get the chamber's endorsement or the board of realtors endorsement or the timber endorsement, but they sort of stayed out of that race as a result of what was going on.
Wow.
And so
things are changing so much, the demographic of the council now, and I mean just the conversation of who's in local leadership. We just had a race with Mark Molina where he was unsuccessful. He's a good friend, and he was telling me a lot about the Dave Ralston days and stuff. And so it's interesting to me how many people haven't been here for very long that are in leadership, because I have lived in Springfield. I bounced back and forth between Eugene and Springfield, but I grew up, I went to middle school and high school in Springfield, so right. I've seen a lot of drastic changes and a lot for the better, but there's also kind of this pullback that we're kind of feeling right now, where people are like, wait a minute, let's not go too far, and that means just the work is not done by any means.
Oh,
So
not at all. No.
so we're going to talk a lot about labor. Next week I'm going to be interviewing an employee from SpaceBuds, which is a local dispensary, and they just recently helped to push to unionize. So having worked with the Teamsters, having worked with the Teamsters for decades, what's your take on employees at organizations like SpaceBuds and Starbucks pushing to unionize?
I think it's way overdue. I wish that the Starbucks people had gotten a little bit more of a head start. Right now, I think that the people at Starbucks are so deserving of representation right now. I mean, they work hard and are not given a lot of input into the way that their workplace operates. And so my only frustration right now is that the group that is representing the Starbucks workers is out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Workers United. I've placed a call. As far as I know, nobody at the Starbucks locations has ever met any of the people from Workers United. It's been strictly an online and phone and telephone relationship. And I would love for them to see some boots on the ground right now and see some people who are actually representing their interests out here. And it's not that I'm trying to poach them or raid them in any way. I just want Workers United to take an active role in the organizing campaigns right now, because they're going to need it. I mean, the companies are very resourceful in mounting anti-union campaigns once even once the cards have come in and they've authorized by election the union representation. The anti-union campaign never ends. The captive audience meetings never end. They're more subtle about them after the election. But what I don't want to see is any sort of backsliding on the part of these units. I hope that they stay solid.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more about the dispensary situation, because it's such a new industry and it's not even really federally recognized. So it's going to be interesting to hear what he has to say. Dakota Lisea is my guest, and he came on a while back because he had just blasted an opinion that I posted on somewhere on social media on a public forum. And I was like, instead of us arguing, let's become friends. And so I messaged him and I had him on, and he's a young guy. And I did the episode called The Youth Vote. So everyone tune in next week. That's going to be a really cool one. I want to talk a little bit about unions, corporations, and government, and kind of what the roles of each area is in our society. Back when I first started this podcast, I had Rick Dancer on, and him and I talked about this. And he said something. He was like, oh, unions and corporations, like we're talking big corporations, right? Unions and corporations, they're one and the same. And I just totally disagree with that. I've always been very pro-union. And it just kind of, I told him a joke that I wanted to tell you. In 2009, the Tea Party movement was really strong. And some young people may not remember this, but the Tea Party basically was a Republican movement that was designed to basically just eliminate any tax. They just wanted as low as taxes as possible and cut government spending, so that the goal was, they say, to basically make it towards having less government programs and whatnot. And it's basically just the conservative attitude where it's like you're on your own. It's like bootstraps kind of stuff. And the joke that I heard was that there's three people sitting at a table. There's a union boss, there's a corporate CEO, and a Tea Party voter. You may have heard this. And there's a dozen cookies sitting in the middle of the table. The corporate CEO grabs 11 cookies and then looks at the Tea Party voter and says, hey, that union guy's trying to take your cookie.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely a very apposite and appropriate joke in this context. Yes. I've also heard that told about the immigrant workers. That immigrant is trying to take your cookie. There are so many different contexts in which that works, and it's almost always true.
Yeah, and I mean this attitude, it's like I've been very vocal. I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter. Like I've taken a lot of my
Go Bernie.
talking points, from that kind of strategy where we need to be pro worker, we need to be I mean, honestly, like, helping people on disability, people that maybe can't even work, so we need to be taking care of people with protections and safety nets, and I think the Democratic Party was once known as the party of the working class voter, and very much pro union. The ethos, like I said, being about protections, safety nets, and workers' rights.
Yes.
Is the party still the better? Go ahead.
Is the party still identified as the working class party?
Well, what I was going to say, do you think that it's still the pro union party?
I think that there was a time when it was. I think the Democrats could lay claim to be the pro union party, and I certainly hope to get us back there. I think in the early '90s, the Democratic Leadership Council, DLC, made a lot of inroads with the Clinton administration and with the party establishment in just turning it into this concept of the Democrats being the party of the professional classes, and being more about just trying to shore up the professional and the managerial classes as the base of the party, on the theory that labor had nowhere to go. And you know what? I mean, in fairness to them, I don't think that labor has really given itself anywhere to go in the last 20 years. We need to find a place that we can be demanding and have leverage over the Democratic Party, because I don't think that there are lots of parts of the Democratic Party that don't care about working people. Now, obviously, Bernie identifies as he caucuses with the Democrats anyway, and he's certainly somebody who represents the interests of working people. I think that what we have to do is we have to get back to a place where we actually the Democrats have been noticeably non-supportive of the Amazon campaign, for instance. I don't know if you've followed this, but they're very nervous because Amazon is a big Democratic contributor. I don't think they want to alienate Amazon, and I think that there's definitely a big segment of the Democratic establishment that does not want to upset the apple cart. They probably don't want to upset Howard Schultz, for that matter. I think they're being sort of guarded and sort of measured in their approach to the Starbucks campaign as well.
I think that just sums up the biggest issue I see in politics is the money, just the money in it, just the money that controls campaigns and then controls policy. And so, I didn't know that. I didn't know that Amazon was a Democratic supporter. I kind of would assume otherwise. I mean, I didn't know that. That's
they give money to both sides. I mean, it's if you look at the oil companies, I mean, they're not just a Democratic contributor. The oil companies are very smart too. They give money to both parties. And
so you're saying Democrat, small d, yeah. So they just have a lot of say in what's happening in elections and just continue to maintain power. Back in 2009, that whole thing I was talking to you about with Rick Dancer, that's the thing. It's like with Democrats, and the quick version of it to me was always with Democrats, you have big government. With Republicans, you have unfettered big corporations. Which one's better? And that's where he was trying to be like, well, definitely the corporations. Like, no, like absolutely not. The reason that unions, if you're going to compare unions to corporations, the reasons that unions are still more something that I could support is because the idea is to protect workers. It's not just to make record profits. That's not all it's about.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And listen closely, because this is the one time that I'm going to agree with Rick Dancer about anything. I think that there is a danger that the unions, when they get too big and too centralized in their power structure, they do start to resemble corporations. Sure. There was a thinker back in the 19th century named Bakunin, whose critique of labor unions was that the further a labor leader gets from the workers, the more he starts to resemble one of the management. And I think it's true, in my union, the last administration, James Hoffa Jr. and his people were all playing golf with the executives at the employers, and we're getting a lot cozier with those guys than they were with the members. And it's inevitable that when you start talking to management more than you are to your own members, then you're going to start thinking like them.
Well,
and it's a problem.
You said straight up, I mean, in the title of the Teamsters union that you work with, the local, is it 205? The local 205. That's a huge, important word right there, because what you were talking about with Starbucks, when it's, and I don't know enough about it to speak badly on them, the union there, but like you said, it's across the country. How could that, how could they fully know what's going on in the lives of a worker in Springfield, Oregon? You know what I mean? So
right.
And when you get to be so big that you've gotten far away from the little guy, that's a problem. Period. And so, I think that's kind of what he was getting at. And like you said, it's a rare time that maybe we can agree on some things. So now changing gears.
There are unions that have what are called super locals, and they're sort of creeping away from the concept of a local. There are unions that have a super local that goes from Miami up to New England, and that to me defeats the purpose of a local. Yeah. I don't think, I think we absolutely need representation. If on Friday I got a call at the Florence UPS Center because one of our members was in trouble, and I drove out to Florence, that's not possible when you're representing members from Philadelphia.
No, absolutely. Now, changing gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about Tuesday's midterm, kind of both locally and nationally. One of the things is that it's like I've seen a big increase in civic participation, but I wonder sometimes if it's mainly just on social media, if it's actually people getting out and doing something. The turnout, it looks like statewide, was in the 30% range. I mean, it's really low,
Yeah, like 35, right?
35%. Maybe it's going to get to 40 when it's all counted. But I mean, still, why do you think that is? Why do you think the turnout is so low? Now, I know historically midterms, Republicans turn out for midterms and Democrats don't, but why do you think that is?
Well, I think that one thing that one blunder that former President Trump made in the wake of his election of his loss in 2020 was that he created this impression of delegitimizing the election process itself. And so a lot of his people, for instance, in Georgia, when there were these runoffs for the Senate, a lot of his people stayed home because they didn't think the election was going to be legitimate, and they didn't bother to vote. And I think there are a lot of people that think that everything's decided before they even fill out their ballots and stick them in the mail. And I regret that. I lament it because it happens on our side too.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you see local elections. Like, I don't think they've announced a winner yet in the county commissioner race for Springfield for Joe Berney versus David Lovell. But
that's right.
It's within like 101 votes as of right now, is what it says on the Secretary of State's website. And oh my gosh, it's so scary to me, the change that we could see by just that one seat changing hands. Joe Berney is somebody that's extremely pro worker, and
he's been a tremendous ally to workers during his term, and it's I think a measure of how consequential Joe Berney's term as commissioner has been, that the timber industry and the real estate, the board of realtors came at him as hard as they did. Was just a measure of how much power and how much influence he's had in policy at the county-wide level.
For me, just as a podcaster, I worry about accessibility. Now, to be fair, I haven't reached out to David Lovell or talked to him, and maybe if he is the winner, maybe I will try to kind of at least hear what he has to say, but also hopefully that he would hear what I have to say, and someone like me, because I mean, this is a small town, and I think that I have a pretty substantial voice, in this town. I've lived here a long time, and so we'll see how it goes.
Hey, do me a favor. I know that Mark's opponent, who is apparently won, Victoria Doyle, she is a union member. Yeah, you ought to reach out to her and just get her take on local labor issues.
I would like
Because it
to.
would certainly be helpful to me.
There was some things. There were some things that she said in forums that at least gave me some hope that she was willing to listen. But I know that's campaigning, and we'll see. But I'm not going to hold
Sure.
my breath. But we'll see how that goes down the road. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the local city council and school board meetings. There's been some extremely threatening behavior recently. I've been reading stuff about threats of violence at the school board meetings. A lot of it's virtual, and so that's sometimes maybe some people get a little more aggressive online, but I haven't been paying as close of attention for a decade. I've been paying attention for the last 5 years to Springfield, or even less, as far as local city government. This podcast, which has been 4 years long, is how I've learned about a lot of city government. But what can we do to lower the temperature, in these meetings where people are just screaming vitriol?
Well, I think that it's that this is going to be sort of a boring politician's answer, but I think we're going to have to lower the temperature at a national level. I think that the outrage machine, people are making a lot of money off the outrage machine in the 24-hour news cycle, and I think the people that are going to the school board meetings and screaming about the vaccine and about masking are being manipulated. And they're being manipulated at a national scale. I think on a local level, as a result of this election, that this commissioner's race should not have been close. Commissioner Burney has done immense work on behalf of workers and on behalf of the voters in Springfield. And the fact that these sort of hot button issues, the vaccines and the wildfires, people are just unhappy and unsettled in general, and they're taking it out on the incumbents. And I think that the people in the unions, it's incumbent on us to try and talk to our members and keep their focus on issues that affect them on a daily basis. Of course, the vaccine did for a while. Wildfires did for a while, but I think we need to just try and convince our members that the solution to the wildfires is not to cut all the trees down. Yeah. I mean, trees are not necessarily the only cause of wildfires. I think that they're, you could argue that they're one of them, but I don't think that they're the one that we need to worry about. What we need to worry about is is all of the effects that we're causing. To make wildfires a clear and present danger to all of us. And I think what we need to do is just educate our voters in a non-elitist, non-condescending way about how it benefits all of us for the wage scales to go up. One of the good things about the pandemic is that people are making a lot more money right now and have a lot more power in the workplace because people are realizing that they're being oppressed by their employers. And
I mean, that's coming with more costs, unfortunately. But that being said, that I'm a fan of that. If there's more, not of the more costs, I'm a fan of the more flexibility. If you have more money, you have more flexibility, so you can choose where you put your money. Hopefully, now I want to say this though. That in the 4J situation, and I agree with you that it starts at the national level, that to lower the temperature. But on the 4J situation, we're seeing stuff that I don't know if there's any, we can't, like, we're seeing threats of violence about guns, about they want to have concealed carry laws on campuses, high school campuses. And this is
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild scene. Yeah, the last scene was pretty ugly. And, this is scary to me that we have, I mean, we're seeing, a continuation of violence that is basically coming from this replacement theory and white supremacy.
Yeah. Right.
I don't even know where to begin. There's the cat making a cameo. Nice. Beset by cats. Yeah.
I agree with you on the Second Amendment stuff too. I mean, that's one of the things that I constantly hear from members, from Teamster members, is that they want to take our guns. And so what you do is, if you're afraid that the government is going to be coming after your guns, then you arm yourself and you decide that you need to have a concealed weapon. It's a reaction to the things that you're concerned about. Can I go on a little bit of a tangent right now?
Absolutely. You got the floor.
Thanks. Okay, there was a DJ in Atlanta, an afternoon talk radio host named David Paul, and so he was a master of the 24-hour news cycle. He would have a different hot button issue every day. One day he decided he was mad at the Russians, and so he wanted America to end its exports of potatoes to the Russians because it wouldn't allow them to make vodka, and so it would bring their way of life to an end. And so about an hour into the show, a caller actually looked some of this stuff up and found out, number one, they don't make vodka out of potatoes anymore. And number two, that we're actually a net importer of potatoes from Russia, not an exporter. And so normally this would more or less just run your show to ground, right? I mean, that it would more or less just end the show. But David Paul instantly reversed course and said, that's exactly what I'm talking about. We need to end these imports of potatoes from Russia because they're trying to kill us with these fried potatoes we're eating. And so for the rest of the show, everybody just talked about fried potatoes and how terrible they were. And so I think, just the point that David Paul, I think, can actually show us is that the outrage machine is not always rational. You have issues that you get your listeners and your audience whipped up about, and whether it's wokeness, I would imagine that people are probably coming to these school meetings wanting to talk about critical race theory and wanting to talk about grooming and talking about pedophilia and whatever they've been told to be outraged about, they're going to be outraged about. And it's a concern because I think that we do have problems with our school systems right now. I think that a lack of critical thinking is part of why we're in the fix we're in right now. And that's what people should be going to school board meetings and hollering about, is just the fact that the schools right now are falling down to a certain extent in their obligation to teach a rising generation of workers how to think critically. That to me would be a legitimate issue.
Yeah, and I mean it's just so scary because, like you said, there's so much misinformation out there. So these people are just driven to anger on stuff that's not even really based in facts. But then we can't, as a society, agree on facts. That's a pretty dangerous thing. I mean, my dad and I talk.
It is.
We talk about COVID stuff, and he's very conservative, and yet he takes COVID as serious as anyone I've ever met. I mean, he's very careful, and he's very worried. Which it should never have been political. But when I bring it up to him, I'm like, two issues. One is COVID, and I'll get to that one in a second. But I say, like, well, you're supporting candidates that are against COVID regulations, and he's like, no, they're not. And I'm like, yeah, they are. Like they literally say they are to you, and you still refuse to acknowledge that. That's one issue. The second issue is Social Security. With him, I'm like, he's like, well, he had literally told me that Biden is trying to take his Social Security, and I'm like, how is that even possible? I mean, that's not even remotely based in fact. And I love my father, very much so. And I've learned so much. I'm grateful that I grew up in a home that he was a conservative Christian man for the reasons that I lived there. And I lived at one point with my lesbian Democrat mom. And so I have a very broad kind of base, and where I was getting my values, The
interesting thing is, your dad, I'm sure he's probably read Rick Scott's 11 points to save America. And one of them is literally to sunset Social Security and Medicare. He says it in black and white.
Right.
And so I would think that would get his attention. I mean, ask him about that the next time you talk to him.
Well, anybody that knows me knows that, especially, I have to be sometimes careful on the podcast because I am a Democrat and I don't want to throw my own party under the bus, but I am very critical of my own team. and that's a healthy thing to do. And so
You have to
what
be.
I don't want to do is I don't want to give fuel for the enemy when they're unwilling to do the same. It's like we want to call balls and strikes on ourselves, but only when you're having somebody that's coming at you in good faith. Because if you have somebody from the opposition party that is unwilling to do the same, all they're going to do is capitalize on your times of vulnerability. And so
I can't remember who it is that said this. It might have been H.L. Mencken, but what this person said was that every decent person is ashamed of his own government, and I think that there's something to be said for that. There are things that you can always do, no matter how good and how functional your government is. There are things that you're not doing, and there are things that you should be doing. And if you're not constantly thinking about how to do things better, then you're backsliding.
So I got a couple more things I want to talk about. One thing is we're going to see a lot of stuff about Betsy Johnson in the state of Oregon, and it seems like there's a lot of ads. I've been hearing that Phil Knight has donated a sizable amount to her campaign. There's this desire and I think Democrats need to listen to this kind of stuff, because there's a desire for third-party type candidates. My dad is already starting to support her. The knock on her, we'll see what happens by November, by conservatives, is that she's just a Democrat. She's a rhino, is what they like to call them. But that's what I hear conservatives saying. Yeah, she's not, but that's what I can hear. But my point is that I think that there's an opportunity with these third-party candidates to bring people, I don't want to say to the middle, but to bring people to the table where we can have constructive conversations. I believe. I'm not supporting her campaign. That's not my point. But we've seen it before with Rand Paul. We've seen it with Bernie Sanders. Very different types of candidates that presented something that was not the two-party mainstream system. And Ross Perot. You remember Ross Perot in the 90s? That there's a lot of conservatives that would support that. My dad told me, he's like, I voted for Perot. So though he's very conservative, he was willing to entertain the thought of a different, an alternative to that. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the Betsy Johnson campaign. Now, last week, Jim Couples was extremely critical of her, saying that she's anti-climate, that, that there's a lot of stuff that I'm not aware much about her. I don't know much of her history. But I mean, do you think that there's something to be learned from the fact that these third-party candidates, they rise up and have a huge backing and a huge following and passionate supporters? How do we rein that into the two-party system? Because I know that Bernie, like you had said, Bernie had ran as a Democrat, but the party would not allow it. And I mean, I'll say that till I'm blue in the face, that they refused to allow it. He would have absolutely won the primary election if it wasn't for all of the people on Super Tuesday backing out. And then he would have won the general election against Trump handily. There's no question in my mind. So I don't know what, I mean, everybody's saying we want change. And then when they present change, people are like, not that though. So I don't know.
Star voting would be a start. It almost won last time. It got 46% of the vote. I think preferred choice voting of some kind is going to be essential if we're going to incorporate the third party candidates. And I think that the duopoly, the Democratic Republican two-headed Hydra, is definitely fighting hard against preferred choice voting for that very reason. They want to continue their sort of hegemony over the electoral process, and we need to have voices that are outside of the Capitol Hill system and network. Perot wasn't wrong about everything. He was right about the deficit. And when Clinton took office, you can bet, Perot's people got 19%, I think, in 92. And you can bet that Clinton jumped right on the deficit right after that. I mean, I'm not sure that deficits are as important as I used to, but he wasn't wrong about it, and he wasn't wrong about corporations outsourcing jobs either. There are lots of jobs that are never going to be coming back as a result of NAFTA and as a result of our trade agreements. So we're going to have to do something we're going to have to modify the trade agreements to make them more equitable and more fair to everyone.
Yeah, I
And
just think that
that was something Perot was jumping on, though. Go
I
ahead.
just think that these third party candidates, I think that there's a lot to be learned from them. I don't necessarily think that they should win. Like you just said, though, the Perot getting 19% was substantial, probably won Clinton the election, but also, there's a lot to be learned. I think Bernie Sanders, in some ways, I wonder if him losing was better for the country, because if he would have won and it didn't work overnight, because it would have been such swift changes that it could have been interesting to see how it played out. But in some ways, the policies are slowly being implemented, and so.
Well, just to state the obvious, the Republicans would have started trying to impeach Bernie Sanders the first day that he took office. I mean, they would be trying to gum up the works with impeachment hearings from the moment that he took office. But in the meantime, Bernie had a plan. He was going to overrule the Senate parliamentarian that's keeping any sort of reform from the filibuster from taking place. He was planning on issuing executive orders that actually helped people instead of hurting people, the way that Trump and Bush have. And I've got to say, I mourn every day that there probably won't be a Bernie Sanders administration, because
Probably not an administration.
However long it lasted. Yeah. Is he? Is he talking about running in 24?
I've been hearing some stuff that he's not ruling it out. I guess you can be 900 years old and be a candidate. I mean, if it's not even, I mean, Bernie is, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are both in the same demographic. They're very, I mean, and I'm not trying to be ageist. It's just that the issues of being forward thinking, I think, we need to get a little bit more youth influence in there for sure.
Well, hey, I'm 900 years old and I'm a candidate, so
you're 800 years old.
There's definitely 800. Sorry,
right?
Yeah, you're right.
Well, Leonard Stoehr.
So anyway, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, that's all I got.
I was gonna say, hey, it's an honor to really get to chat with you. I'm a big fan of what you're doing on the council, and I look forward to just continuing to learn more about this whole process. I really appreciate how accessible people have been. When I started interviewing people for the podcast in the political world, I was overwhelmed with Eugene, to be fair. And I live in Springfield, and I was like, well, maybe if I start tackling Springfield city government, it'll be a little bit more digestible, because it's just a smaller town, and it's a smaller, it's a lot less to kind of focus on. There's still the same, massive issues of homelessness and all kinds of stuff that happen, but I can digest a little more. And I've learned a tremendous amount. And I just appreciate the accessibility, that when I reach out to you to be a guest, that you seem enthusiastic about it, and that I get treated fairly and honestly, because I'm just a barber that is learning on this stuff as I go, and so I just appreciate.
You're a very well-informed barber. You're sort of the platonic ideal for me of what a voter should be, because you're curious and you're willing to do your homework and finding and sort of getting to the bottom of what these issues are. And I appreciate your podcast, and I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. If anybody's listening, you want to shout, on the tagline you can read on the bottom. If you want to make a happy patty, you can make a donation on Venmo. It's @SpentTheRent. Or you can go to my website, strpod.com/sponsors. Just go to STRPod and click around. There's a donate button, and you can donate through Patreon or PayPal for a monthly donation, or the link is right there for Venmo. And it really helps me a lot. I just bought this new mic, and it was not cheap. And my girlfriend is going to kick me out if I keep spending money on this podcast and it doesn't become a little bit fruitful. I don't do it for money, but I definitely would like to break even, And so I'm going pretty hard into this, and I've been doing this for 4 years, and I'd like to really start advertising. I think I'm ready to start marketing it so that I can reach an audience that I haven't reached. So far, it's been very organic, which has been awesome. And a lot of my guests are my friends that I've met through the podcast, or I've had guests that became friends, and I've had friends that have became guests, but it's been really fun. And I've learned just a tremendous amount. But Leonard Stoehr, Springfield City Council, thank you so much for doing this. I know today you're going to be hopping on a plane heading. So that's why we did this early in the day, is because you're going to be heading to Rhode Island. Is that correct?
That's right. I'm going to be representing the passenger transportation members out here in the West at a hearing in Rhode Island. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing Providence for the first time in a long time. When I was a Navy brat, I was through there, but not for any length of time.
So in your travels as a Navy brat, where was your favorite place that you lived? Is that even possible to say?
Well, when I was 5 and 6 years old, San Diego was a great place to live because there was the zoo, and there was the beach, and there was Tijuana. I mean, even back then, at that point in my life, I could appreciate how different Tijuana was. I mean, with their tattoo parlor and dental extraction businesses. I loved Knott's Berry Farm. I loved Disneyland. I mean, for a 5 and 6 year old, it was the best place in the world to live. So at the time, I loved that. If I could, if I could have any choice, I would probably live in New Orleans now. I mean, if I had a backup to Springfield, Oregon, then that would probably be a solid second choice. But
yeah, San Diego is near and dear to my heart. Both of my parents are from San Diego. And so my grandparents and all that lived in San Diego. And so I've spent some time down there, and it is beautiful. And as far as Southern California, that's probably the only place I would consider living. Los Angeles, absolutely not. But it's been a long time since I've been down there, but I need to make it back down there. My parents were, my grandparents were really good friends with Bill Walton's parents, because my dad went to high school. Yeah, in San Diego. So it is very near and dear to my heart, and I agree with you. It's an amazing place to be. So, hey, we're going to get out of here. Yeah. Leonard Stoehr, thank you so much for doing this. This is the Spent the Rent podcast. I appreciate you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Patty.